aside, but just because, I want to get to more questions and I don't want to keep you here too long. This is a study that was published about 5 or 6 years ago down at Stanford when Kevin Ochsner, who's the first author, who's working with James Gross, who I hope you know something about his work, very, very good work on the role of cognitive attribution in understanding psychology and the mechanism of emotional regulation. And basically what Ochsner did when he was a postdoc at Stanford, he now has a lab at Columbia, if he took some very good psychological work done by James Gross and basically reproduced it in an fMRI machine, and came up with a study that's been pretty foundational because the basic principle in this study has been reproduced quite a few times now. And so the basic working principle in rough terms is that when you reappraise an emotionally arousing scene, as you increase your cognitive control, the intensity or the certainly uncontrollability of the emotional response to that scene decreases. So what that translates into is better modulation of emotional response. So the way this experiment works is you show people a picture in which elicits emotion. Now this picture elicits some emotion. It's obviously a picture of people crying, and the key point here is this: under the picture, they do out-of-scanner training, which of course they always do, to sort of just prep the people to be able to do the task. But when they're in the scanner and they've been, they know basically how the paradigm works, under the picture is either the word reappraise or the word attend. Now, when I have more time and I give sort of a little more philosophically sophisticated, presentation about these kinds of things, I start by saying these are just squiggly lines. And if you're left with the question of how these squiggly lines, by impinging on the retina and ending up in the occipital cortex and so on and so forth, lead to the kind of changes, that's where you start to get into the issue of just how unreliable or incomplete or squiggly letters, which a human cognition can recognize as a word, under the picture. And when you say reappraise, it basically is giving an instruction to the person to say, view this picture in a way that doesn't evoke a lot of emotion. And this is obviously an easy picture, and it doesn't evoke a lot of emotion. And so the people can look at it and simply go, well, they're sad now, but the next day they felt better. Whatever they were worried about, it turned out okay. Or sometimes they say, well, it's tears of joy. They're at a wedding. Some people that works for, it doesn't work well for me, but the point is it doesn't even matter how you do it. The key is to reappraise the picture so that it doesn't elicit a strong emotional response. Now, when they actually collected the brain data that I'm about to show you, they didn't use pictures that are easy like this, or not. They used very, very arousing, very, very upsetting auto accident photos that have been standardized as causing significant emotional and autonomic nervous system arousal in people who see them. And even then, you could pretty easily train people to reappraise the picture of a horrific auto accident scene. And one of the techniques that they found worked well for that is by having people to just pretend in their mind that they're an emergency medical technician. These are not medically trained people at all. These are actually just, lay people, undergraduates, and other people from the community down in Palo Alto, and they're not medically trained at all. But just imagining in their mind that they are emergency medical technicians and they've arrived on this scene and they have to make a triage and they have to keep their emotions in check. That turned out to be a cardinal strategy that was very good for controlling emotional response. So basically, when it said reappraise, if that was the strategy you chose to use, and you're looking at this horrific auto accident scene, you reappraise by saying, okay, make believe you're an emergency medical technician, and I have to keep cool, and I have to be calm. Or it says attend, just look at it, make no cognitive intervention in yourself, and just look at the picture, which does cause autonomic and emotional responses. So this is the brain changes that occurred in those two states. So the now pretty classic finding is that if you just look at the picture, attend, just look at the upsetting picture, you get very reliable activations in areas of the orbitofrontal cortex and, of course, as you would absolutely expect, in the amygdala. And so the key point of the study, though, is that's the finding that you absolutely would expect. The thing that's interesting about this study is what happens to the brain when the people are telling themselves, I'm an emergency medical technician, don't let this make you upset, you have to keep your emotions in check because you have to be able to provide aid to these people. When people just think about it that way, it completely changes how their brain responds to the scene. And they get these dorsolateral convexity activations. And it turns out, this is an early finding, which I imagine some of you probably know, even though this is on the left, it could be on the left, but also now, as I'm going to show you in a little later data, on the right side, there's now an abundance of data showing that this right or left, in this experiment, it turned out to be the left, probably just because of the linguistic complexity of doing the reappraising task in this paradigm. But you get an inferior frontal cortex, a ventrolateral prefrontal cortex activation that has a very significant, now in many studies, and I'm going to show you more data in a moment, a very significant inverse correlation with activation in the amygdala. So that's the key finding. The key finding in what is now a classic paper is that when you reappraise, you activate lateral prefrontal cortex, and in fact it looks like it's inferior. The key place you activate in terms of what correlates with the amygdala decrease is the inferior lateral prefrontal cortex. And when you do that, you markedly decrease the amount of orbitofrontal cortex activation that you get. You see that right here. So when you reappraise, you really reduce back to baseline, to unstimulated. So in this column is saying when you just attend, when you just look at the upsetting picture, you get very significant medial orbitofrontal cortex and especially amygdala, very important activation when you just look at it. When you reappraise, you get lateral prefrontal activation and eliminate the limbic response. Okay, so the point of that turns out to be, obviously, that how you cognitively appraise emotionally upsetting experience has radically large effects, not only on your emotional responses, but on how your brain responds to the scene. And remember, the only thing that's cueing here, the only difference in the pictures are those squiggly lines under the picture. The squiggly line that we call the word reappraise in one picture and the squiggly line that we call the word attend in the other. That's the only difference. It causes these radical differences in how the brain responds to the scene. The mind, we posit, has a lot to do with that. And we posit now that the quantum Zeno effect has a lot to do with how that happens. If I'm successful here, someday I might even get somebody like Kevin Oxner to say this too. Haven't succeeded at that yet, though. I'm sure you're going to all help me with that. So the mental act of focusing attention tends to hold in place brain circuits associated with whatever is focused on. This is kind of the functional neuroscience application of the quantum Zeno effect. The mental act of focusing attention tends to hold in place brain circuits associated with whatever is focused on. In other words, focusing attention on your mental experience maintains brain state arising in association with that experience. So that when you reappraise and you say, I'm a medical technician, that act activates, as it were. We can talk about how the appropriate action template for viewing yourself as a medical technician and getting a lateral convexity activation occurs. We're happy, for theoretical reasons, to use classical neuroscience to explain that. Whether that's really true or not is, but we don't want to be we don't want to make too big claims early on. So we're going with classical neuroscience to answer the question, how does that action template get activated in the first place? And that makes us friendly with all the, regular brain imaging people, etc. But all we're trying to do is add to that the dynamic of how do you hold it in place, given all the countervailing effects that would occur in the brain when you're looking at this very upsetting picture. And the way you hold it in place is by focusing on it with the perspective of an emergency medical technician. Now this and that brings into play the quantum Zeno effect, which will physically hold in place the action template in the lateral convexity that inhibits the amygdala. That model has now been applied again and again and again in neuroscience, in functional brain imaging, although this dynamical explanation doesn't usually seem to show up in the discussion section for whatever reason. So here's my friend Mario Beauregard. He actually is closer to thinking about these things. Among functional neuroimaging people, he's pretty close. He's kind of, he was the third author on a paper that Henry and I did that was published in the proceedings of in the philosophical transactions. So in 2005, Schwartz, Stapp, Mario Beauregard published in the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society of Great Britain B is basically a long theoretical paper on this whole theory. So this is a study that Mario did in which it's basically the same exact experimental paradigm. Instead of using upsetting, violent photos, he used erotic photos. It's essentially the same exact study. Instead of using violent pictures, you use erotic pictures. And with the erotic pictures, it's interesting, he does see this robust hypothalamic activation. But, there's the amygdala again, the amygdala and the temporal pole. So you still get this, robust temporal activation, but he also sees this, very interesting hypothalamic activation. And then, similarly, he didn't actually put a word under the picture, but he could have. He basically just told the people, don't allow yourself to become sexually aroused, or just look at it. And one of the funny things that just happens to be a fact, and I always like to say it because it is funny and it is a fact, is that all of the females, but not all of the males, could do this task. So there you have it. But it was in Montreal, and they are French-speaking, so that might have some causal effect. Okay, so but the point is that when they did it, yes, they eliminated the diencephalon and temporal lobe activation, but in its place, exactly as you would expect from the Ochsner study, although these studies were done contemporaneously, they didn't know each other were doing it, so they did it independently. You get an activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and also the cingulate gyrus, and the cingulate gyrus, of course, is activated by essentially all effortful mental action. So, and this is just, again, so the key point is that to remove the hypothalamic and temporal lobe activation of looking at an erotic film and not getting aroused, you activate dorsolateral and cingulate. Okay, but now it's getting sort of better. So the summary here is the brain puts out the call, the mind decides whether to listen. Volitional effort is effort of attention. Okay, I'm just going to do one or two more experiments that basically, again, these are new, though. So this is like new data. Well, it's 07 now, but this is a study which also has become a classic study of its kind because it's the third reproduction of this same experimental paradigm. This is an experimental paradigm that was originally published by Hariri and Mazziata at UCLA about 10 years ago now. And Matthew Lieberman took that paradigm and kind of cleaned up all the odds and ends of it, and published a paper that really is a clean demonstration of the effect of relabeling on emotional response to angry faces, as we're going to see. So this is an interesting paradigm. You look at all the subjects do is look at the pictures of these faces. Now, there's two aspects to the task: an affect labeling, and so identify the affect, or the cognitively trivial, identify the gender of the face. So if you look at the affect label, in the affect label task, you look at the face and you pick, is she scared or is she angry? And if I can see it at this angle, it looks like she's angry, okay? That's the task. The control for that task is look at the face and say, is this person named Sam or Helen? This is obviously trivially easy, okay? So you look in Helen, okay? Then and then the other is affect match. You know, you look at this and say, which of these two faces matches his affect? And it's her, right? Because they're both angry. And then in this, it's, again, trivially easy. This person has the same gender as that person, okay? Okay, good. And then the other is you just look at the face, okay? And that's a control. It turns out, I mean, one of the interesting things you could say, if you ask people in which of these tasks, in one of these tasks, the amygdala became much less activated than in any of the other tasks. Does anyone want to take a guess? In which one of these tasks was there a marked decrease in amygdala activation compared to the other tasks? Which one? Shape. Oh, no, shape didn't do any. Shape is kind of neutral, but you're right. Shape, I didn't point out shape. Yes, shape doesn't, you're right. Shape is right, shape is the right answer, but except for shape, because shape doesn't activate it, of course. But except for shape, I'm sorry. My mistake. I mean, I thought, not shape. Okay, so shape is the right answer to the question I asked, but it's obviously a trivial answer. Okay. Well, time's up, no need to play the game. The thing that's so interesting is that you would think, perhaps because of the difficulty of the task, that this would not be the one where the amygdala gets the least aroused. But consistently, again and again and again, that's exactly what you see, is that when you label the emotion, you get half as much amygdala activation as if you just look at it. Or you match the gender. So that's the amount of amygdala activation if you're doing that. But if you're doing that, if you're giving the name, or matching the emotion, or matching the sex, the amygdala really, what does the amygdala respond to? The emotion in the face. So the point of this experiment is that when you put a label on the emotion in the face, the cognitive act of looking at the face with the question in your mind, what kind of emotion is that, cuts the amygdala activation in half. If you just look at the face going, oh, what's the sex of that person? Is that Sam or Helen? Trivially easy task, and the people don't feel like they're getting scared. It's not scary to look at the face. They don't know they don't know that their amygdala is getting more activated, but it is. So just looking at a face, saying, is that Sam or Helen, gives twice as much amygdala activation as looking at it and saying, is she scared or angry? And presumably, it would be because you're doing this cognitive action. Now, the functional neuroanatomy of this has now been worked out reasonably well. And I'm just going to show you one more experiment, which is the same experiment as this, because a guy named Cresswell, who's now at Carnegie Mellon, when he was still at UCLA, took the same exact paradigm and ran all new subjects and had a very interesting additional finding. But this is from the Lieberman paper, and he's basically showing that this right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, basically the same area on the other side from what was just in the Ochsner study, that gets activated, and that activation correlates with a decrease in the amygdala. Now, here is, I think, the big take-home message for this session in terms of the functional neuroanatomy. Cresswell took the same exact experimental paradigm, and all he did was, before they did the experiment, I mean, I don't mean right before the experiment, but in the process of evaluating the subjects, they gave this scale, which is now a nicely validated scale for a quality that's called mindful awareness. And this is a scale that was largely based on the research of Kirk Warren Brown at Virginia Commonwealth University. And he's done a really nice job trying to do the psychometrics of evaluation of mindful awareness. And so they basically use these 15 questions. I think they've expanded the scale since. But if we just look at sort of some of the high factor loading items on the scale, you'll get the kind of thing they're looking for mentally. So number 8 here is a factor loading 0.74. I rush through activities without really being attentive to them. So all of these are inversely scored. So people who answer more no to that or give lower ratings on that because it's ranked on a 1 to 6 scale, if you have lower rankings on questions like that, you're assumed to have higher mindful awareness. And so let's look at some of the other ones. This one is high. I do jobs or tasks automatically without being aware of what I'm doing. People who tend to endorse that item are considered to have less mindful awareness. Let's just look one or two more. I find myself doing things without paying attention. People who do not endorse that are considered to have higher mindful awareness, okay, etc. Now, all they did in this simple experiment, they did the same exact paradigm that I just showed you from the Lieberman study. They were in the Lieberman lab. Lieberman's a co-author on this paper. They took all new subjects, though, gave them this scale, and basically then looked at correlations between how they did on this scale and what the brain did. And what they found was that the people who get higher mindful awareness get more activation in the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, it is definitely true that in the original Lieberman work, and he has actually spent a lot of effort showing that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is instrumental in the mechanism whereby the inferior frontal cortex deactivates the amygdala. So there's been a lot of work to try to endorse that, and it seems like a very, very good hypothesis. There's a lot of data to support it now. What this Cresswell paper is showing is that this area of medial prefrontal cortex gets more activated in people who have higher mindfulness. So this was actually the most robust correlation they had in the whole study, was that higher mindfulness people have more medial prefrontal cortex activation. But it also was significant for the ventrolateral and for the ventral medial prefrontal. So there's ventral medial prefrontal. So ventral medial prefrontal is the area that Lieberman had studied, and others have studied. Quirk. There are a whole list of researchers, even in rodents, this area seems to be activated in behavioral paradigms where you decrease anxiety-type responses. He's basically showing that in people who have more mindfulness, you get a more robust activation of this medial prefrontal area. And the other thing that's very interesting, and then as you would expect, in the amygdala, you get the inverse relationship. The more mindful they are, the less amygdala activation they get. But the other thing that's important and interesting about this finding, this paper, which was in the, I think, Journal of Psychological Medicine in 2007, Cresswell, Baldwin, Way. So Cresswell, Way, W-A-Y, Lieberman are three authors on it. And the other thing that's very interesting is they took the data and basically just divided the top half of people on the people who got the higher half. If you rank order the mindful awareness scale and look at the top half and the bottom half. So the people who had the higher half of mindful awareness scale, more mindful awareness and less mindful awareness. Only the people in the top half of mindful awareness had robust correlations between the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and decreased amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex and decreased amygdala. So not only did you get more activation in those areas in the higher mindfulness state, only the people in the top half, that's just the way they analyzed the data, had very significant, and they were very significant correlations between activations in those areas and decrease in the amygdala. The people in the lower half of the rankings did not show significant correlations between these medial and lateral prefrontal cortex areas and amygdala deactivation. So that's it. And again, I'm going to say it has to do with the quantum Zeno effect. The way you focus attention sustains, and this is the point that we really want to pursue just to make it more quantitative and get the finding more solid, that the thing that holds together, see, these are the kinds of questions that they don't ask in neuroscience now. What holds together this circuit of inferior frontal cortex, medial frontal cortex, and amygdala. Yeah, there are 3 structures. They're connected. But what's holding them together? What's making them work together? What's causing them to fire together as an action template? So that the inferior frontal cortex and the medial frontal cortex connect to decrease the activity in the amygdala. What is causing that action template? What's the connective tissue, as we were speaking about? That, and our answer to that question is the quality of attention itself. The mindfulness of attention, sustained, holds in place this action template. That is basically our, I mean, if I had more time, I'd show placebo effect data. We don't have time. It's enough. I mean, you've been really, really patient. It's an hour and 40 minutes. It's enough. But that's it. So that, hopefully we have made the case today that quality of attention has marked effects on neural dynamics, and that this statement is now very well grounded in physical theory. Thank you very much for your attention. And now we have a half hour till whatever, and we'll
so we
stay
have
and do
plenty
whatever
of time for questions. Questions up here. So basically, yeah, that's really an interesting thing, because I mean the whole classical physics doesn't. Maybe I can try with a question, and then maybe
sure.
More instigated to ask something. So essentially, yeah, in classical physics, the whole free will cannot be inferred in a way. It's like a mystical subject.
It's not only not inferred, it's actively denied. I mean, this is why you always hear, all these books that have been published by people at Harvard, so how high quality it must be. I mean, but with leaving all of that aside, but I mean, yes, what's this guy's? I mean, they seem to cluster in Harvard at this era. I don't know why, but there's been a lot of noise coming out of Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, saying, free will does not exist. Science proves it. We say bunk.
Yeah, exactly, and that's actually the results that you show exactly point that there's marks.
It's based on a theoretical predisposition that's not reasonable.
Yeah, and
so your theory is that in classical quantum mechanics, free will does not exist.
Not classical quantum mechanics, in classical physics, not quantum mechanics, in classical non-quantum mechanics.
Understanding, you're saying that it does exist. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, I'll just give the short answer, and he can give the longer answer.
Okay.
Here's what we're saying, we're saying that classical physics denies the existence of causally efficacious choice. Quantum mechanics assertively allows the existence of physically, dynamically effective choice. I mean,
does that answer your question?
So you just wanted that clarification of,
yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Newtonian classical mechanics denies that the mind does anything. That's what the word epiphenomenal means. We have that word epiphenomenal in there. The word epiphenomenal means to the degree that the phenomena is real, it's caused completely by other phenomena. It doesn't do anything itself. And in classical physics and in all the philosophy of mind that comes out of classical physics, consciousness either doesn't exist. People like down in San Diego, what's their name? No, the neurophilosophy, the Churchland, the Churchland gang. I mean, says years ago, Paul Churchland went all the way to saying it doesn't even exist. Consciousness itself is an illusion. And I always like to point out that what was it, the year before last, the Time magazine, on its cover, Time magazine has on its cover an article basically featuring Pinker, and right on the cover it said, think you're conscious? Science says you may not be. You better think again about that. Science says you may not even be conscious. So don't be so sure you're conscious, because, these smart guy, Pinker wrote an article on that. So, I mean, the people who take classical physics as the only causal mechanism either say consciousness doesn't even exist, or at best, if it exists, it doesn't do anything. And another way of saying that that's a little more fancy is it's epiphenomenal. That's a fancy way of saying it exists, but it doesn't do anything. Consciousness is epiphenomenal means, okay, we'll give it to you, it exists, but it doesn't do anything, because the brain does it all. But quantum mechanics denies that and says that is a false theory. And conclusions like that are false because the theory is false when applied to mind-brain and a lot more than mind-brain. Classical physics doesn't explain data at the level of ions, and the brain works at the level of ions. That's the critical dynamic.
So I have two questions. One, I don't know your field too well because I'm in cardiovascular, but I find it absolutely fascinating. And when I see your slides, I think about it from the perspective of stroke or Parkinson's.
Great.
And
that just made it worth coming, what you just said.
Well,
because that's exactly what we're trying to do.
For me as well. So let me ask you, because you study OCD, right?
Yes.
So can you just give us a thumbnail sketch the application of this?
Oh, yeah, sure. But you know, because you mentioned that, I am so proud. One of the things I'm